Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. The following bizarre series of incidents took place in 2018 and involves a potential slip into a parallel universe. While the names and dialogue provided are fictionalised for storytelling, they are grounded in real events. Greg Chapman was leading an ordinary life as a successful business owner when his world suddenly started to subtly shift around him in mystifying ways. These bizarre alterations to his perceived reality caused Greg and his wife Diane to start questioning everything they thought they knew about the nature of existence. Little did they know their lives were about to take a turn down a path of no return into a constantly shifting world at odds with their day-to-day experience. Greg had always considered himself a rational and mentally balanced guy. He and Diane lived in a small town in California where they enjoyed taking daily walks through the local parks and running errands around town. But starting in 2018, the couple began noticing perplexing changes to familiar places and objects around their town. It was as if the very fabric of their world was rearranging itself when they weren't looking. At first, Greg and Diane kept these disorienting observations to themselves, but after witnessing several undeniably impossible alterations to their everyday environment, together with their own eyes, they knew something inexplicable was happening. The sensible, straightforward lives they had known now appeared to be shifting into uncharted territories of mystery. One afternoon in March of 2018, Greg and Diane pulled into the parking lot of their local grocery store to pick up some items for dinner. They had shopped at this grocer at least twice a week for the past 7 years since moving to the town in 2011. The couple knew the layout of the store and surrounding lot like the back of their hands. As Greg parked the car, he immediately noticed something was off. Directly facing the grocery store entrance stood a large glass elevator attached to the neighbouring multi-level parking garage. Greg stared blankly, not quite believing his eyes. How could a massive elevator shaft have been constructed literally overnight without him noticing? It stood directly in the middle of the walking path leading to the grocery store's front automatic doors, obstructing the route Greg and Diane had always taken. Exchanging bewildered looks, Greg asked, "When did they build that elevator? It looks brand new." Diane just shook her head, at a loss for words. She didn't remember seeing an elevator there the previous day either. Cautiously, they approached the structure as if half expecting it to vanish before their eyes, its starkly modern appearance contrasting with the dated exterior of the parking garage. Greg flagged down a woman exiting the elevator. "Excuse me, but is this a new addition to the parking garage?" The woman gave him an odd look. "No, it's been here for years, at least as long as I've been here." Greg went off to ask a few other customers too, who all said the same thing. Greg rejoined Diane, who was scrolling on her phone. "Take a look at this," she said, showing him an image of the elevator on Google Street View. "It's been here since at least 2009. "How? That's impossible," Greg muttered. "We walk by here literally multiple times a week. How could we have missed a huge elevator being here for almost a decade?" Diane shook her head at a total loss. The fact that they both vividly shared the same clear memory of no elevator existing was deeply unsettling. They cut their grocery trip short, too distracted by the day's bizarre revelation. Driving home, the elevator lingered in both their minds like an unsolvable riddle. One afternoon in April, Greg and Diane took their usual evening walk around a local park, located a few blocks from their home. They had strolled the park's trail countless times before. It was a small park, so even any minor differences would have been easy for them to spot. About halfway through their walk, Greg stopped abruptly. "Sorry, but do you see that?" Greg asked in disbelief, pointing toward a blue informational board posted near the path. Diane's jaw dropped open. A large park map and various facts about local wildlife were displayed on the colourful sign. "I guess the park must have added some new informational displays," Diane offered weakly. "Overnight?" Greg snorted. "Let's take a closer look." Approaching the sign's metal edges were rusted, the paint badly chipped. It looked decades old, not freshly installed. Both he and Diane knew for a fact there had never been informational displays in the park before now. But according to the sign's age, it had been there for years. Over the course of the walk, they passed a dozen more of the large displays posted periodically around the loop trail. All looked worn and weathered, as if they had stood for years untouched, yet neither Greg nor Diane recalled ever seeing them until that day. How could an entire setup of park signs suddenly appear overnight like this, they thought. They were both certain the signs had not been there on their previous walk the night before. After the baffling alterations witnessed at the parking garage next to the grocery store and the park, Greg and Diane found themselves confronted by a new perplexing change to their world just days later. The couple had continued walking regularly through their local park. One evening, before sunset, they approached a plain cement bench to rest for a few minutes. "Hold on, that's not right," Greg murmured, stopping before the bench. Diane followed his gaze and suddenly gasped. 2 large bronze plaques had been embedded in the cement bench, a man's face cast in profile on each one. The plaques looked tarnished and worn, but both Diane and Greg instantly knew they had never been there before. "Those definitely weren't on this bench yesterday," Diane stated. They distinctly remembered sitting here just the night before. The bench had been a simple poured concrete design, nothing more. Greg bent to examine the plaques more closely, studying the engraved words, dedicating the bench to a man who had passed away, accompanied by a generic-sounding quote and the dates marking his birth and death, indicating he had died more than a decade earlier. In the years of walking the path, they surely would have noticed if any of the benches suddenly contained memorials. The plaque's aged appearance also seemed to imply that it had been embedded in the concrete bench for years. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Diane trailed off. "How does this keep happening? And why is it happening to us?" Over the next few evenings' walks, Greg and Diane inspected all the park benches. Each contained the same style of bronze plaque memorial. They contacted the park office to try and find out more about the plaques and when they might have been installed, but they had no record of the project. Greg and Diane knew without doubt that these new features had simply materialised out of nowhere, but who would believe such an insane story? The couple kept their bizarre experiences to themselves, not wanting friends to think they were losing their minds. But an undeniable question lingered: what was causing portions of their reality to rewrite themselves without explanation? Greg turned to online forums seeking answers, wondering if ideas about parallel universes, the Mandela effect, or simulation theory might offer answers to the impossible changes he and Diane had witnessed. No scientific explanation seemed able to fully account for rows of weathered park signs or plaques appearing overnight, or an almost decade-old elevator suddenly standing where empty space had been just a day earlier. Over the next month, Greg and Diane started paying closer attention to other features of their town that they would have usually taken for granted. Small, subtle changes continued to materialise. A new walking trail at a nearby park that they had never noticed before. Unfamiliar speed bumps on their daily commute. Shops in town neither of them recognised. It felt like they were living in a town suddenly full of unfamiliar details. Had they just been so staggeringly unobservant for so many years that the presence of these things was able to pass them by? It simply made no sense. Something more inexplicable had to be at hand. Try as they might, neither Greg nor Diane could find anyone else who recalled any of the same alterations to their reality. It was as if Greg and Diane's very perception of reality had splintered away from the consensus shared by the rest of the world. Despite what most people would likely think, they are both certain they are experiencing something very real together. Greg takes comfort in at least having Diane by his side to confirm the changes, and doesn't think he could handle it on his own if she began doubting her own mind. However, unfortunately, it seems like their shifting world will remain a private purgatory that they must weather alone.